The deep hum of the observatory's machinery reverberated through the walls, a constant reminder of the vast distance between them and everything familiar. Dr. Elise Morgan sat at her desk, eyes fixed on the monitor as line after line of data scrolled past. The team had expected routine updates from the James Webb Space Telescope that day, celestial snapshots, chemical readouts from exoplanet atmospheres, but what they received instead was a puzzle. Elise leaned closer as the image loaded, a colossal, intricate structure orbiting K2-18b. The star's dim, reddish glow bathed the strange object in a halo of muted light. It was vast, almost skeletal, its framework looping and interweaving in ways that defied engineering norms. The structure's lines curved too smoothly, almost like tendons wrapped around bone. Elise's breath caught in her throat. It was alive, or at least something that imitated life disturbingly well. Her earpiece crackled. "Elise, you're seeing this too, right?" Dr. Jian's son's voice was unsteady. "Yes," Elise murmured, her voice hollow with awe. She didn't need to ask what he meant. No one could misinterpret what they were looking at. It wasn't an artifact of physics. It wasn't an anomaly in the data. It was a creation. Lieutenant Connor Hayes entered the lab with long, deliberate strides, glancing between the team as if gauging their reactions. He stopped behind Elise's chair, crossing his arms. "What the hell am I looking at?" "A megastructure," Elise whispered. "Or at least something that resembles one." Connor frowned. If this was built by something, why hasn't any other signal from K2-18b shown this before? Dr. Mia Torres, seated at the station beside Elise, rubbed her temples, eyes fixed on the pulsating lattice-like image. "It's almost biological," she muttered, "but symmetrical. No life form builds like this." Jian leaned in, adjusting his headset. His screen displayed strange frequency readouts. "I ran an analysis on the faint radio signals embedded in the data stream," he began, his face pale. "There's something auditory encoded in the wavelength." Elise narrowed her eyes. "Auditory." Jian hesitated, then activated the file. The sound crackled from the speakers, a faint hum, growing louder, fluctuating into an eerie, rhythmic pulse. The room filled with something that wasn't quite a voice, but carried an unmistakable cadence, like whispered fragments of a language too alien to grasp. The team sat in silence, transfixed. The whispers fluctuated, dropping to a low hum and then spiking to a keening pitch. Elise shivered as the sound bored into her skull, triggering some primal instinct to recoil. She reached out and tapped a button, killing the playback. What the hell was that? Connor's expression darkened. Jian removed his headset, his fingers trembling. It wasn't random. It's a pattern. Something, or someone, is broadcasting it. Elise exchanged a wary glance with Mia. "A distress signal?" Mia asked, though her tone lacked conviction. Elise wasn't sure how to respond. The sound didn't seem like a cry for help. It felt like something older, something that watched rather than beckoned. Jian spoke again, almost in a whisper. "I don't think it's asking for help. I think it's reaching out." His eyes were glassy, distant. "It's waiting for something or someone." Connor slammed a hand on the console, jolting everyone. "That's enough," he barked. We don't know what we're hearing. For all we know, this is some kind of stellar echo or gravitational interference." Jian didn't argue, but his gaze remained fixed on the screen. The whispers. They were still in his mind, like an itch he couldn't reach. That night, the hum of the observatory's generators felt louder than usual. Elise sat alone at her desk, staring at the freeze frame of the megastructure. The longer she looked, the more she noticed its subtleties, small filament-like strands connecting its larger sections. The strands coiled and branched in ways that reminded her of neurons. Her eyes burned, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. The whispers played in her mind again. This time, she imagined they carried intent, a pressure growing slowly but steadily behind her thoughts. A knock startled her. Mia stood in the doorway, clutching a thermos. "I figured you could use some coffee," Mia said softly, walking over. Elise blinked, her spell broken. "Thanks." She accepted the cup and took a sip, the warmth cutting through the cold knot in her stomach. "You should get some rest," Mia urged. "We've been staring at this thing all day. It's starting to get under our skin." Elise nodded, though she knew she wouldn't sleep, not after hearing those sounds. The following morning, Jane didn't show up for the team briefing. Elise sent Connor to check on him, half expecting to hear that he'd worked through the night and passed out. But when Connor returned, his face was grim. "He's not in his quarters," Connor said. "His bed hasn't been touched." Panic bubbled in Elise's chest. Where the hell would he go? They found Jian in the observatory's sensor room, hunched over a console. His headphones were still on, the faint hiss of static playing through them. His face was pale, slick with sweat. "Jian." Elise grabbed his shoulder. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. He yanked the headphones off as though they burned him. "It's in my head, Elise," he gasped. "I can hear it, louder than before." His voice cracked, raw from screaming. Mia's face twisted with concern. "Jian, you've been sitting here all night. You need rest." He shook his head violently. "You don't understand. I didn't play it again. It played itself. The signal changed. It's closer." Elise felt her blood turn cold. Jian's eyes darted nervously toward the glass viewport, as though he expected something to be there. Connor's patience snapped. He grabbed Jean by the arm and pulled him to his feet. "You're losing it. We've all been under stress." "I'm not crazy," Jean screamed. His voice reverberated through the quiet room. "It's not interference. It's alive." Connor and Elise exchanged a look. Jian's breathing slowed, but his trembling didn't stop. As Connor led Jian out of the room, Elise stayed behind, staring out of the viewport into the void beyond. In the distance, K2-18b shimmered faintly. Orbiting above it, the megastructure loomed like an impossible wound stitched into the fabric of space. Elise thought of Jian's words and whispered them to herself. "It's alive." The shuttle's engines roared to life, the cabin trembling as the team prepared for descent. The megastructure's silhouette loomed larger than ever in the viewport, its tangled, lattice-like web extending outward like skeletal wings. Even from this distance, Elise could see how the structure shimmered faintly, as if coated in some strange organic sheen that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. Elise tightened her harness and glanced around at the others. Connor sat across from her, double-checking his rifle, though it was more out of habit than necessity. His jaw was clenched tight, eyes locked forward. Next to him, Mia stared at the floor, twisting the straps of her gear between her fingers. Jean, though unnervingly quiet, had insisted on coming. His skin was pallid and dark circles rimmed his eyes, but Elise didn't have the heart to refuse him. Whatever the whispers had done to him, he seemed convinced that facing them was the only way to silence them. The calm crackled as the pilot's voice came through. "Approaching K2-18b station, docking in 5 minutes. You're gonna want to see this." Elise leaned toward the viewport. The research station, a multi-tiered structure of steel and glass, drifted in orbit near the megastructure like a fragile insect hovering beside a predator. It had once been pristine, its surface gleaming under starlight. Now, sections of it had been overtaken by an alien growth. Fleshy, translucent webs stretched across the station's hull, pulsating faintly. Thick, root-like tendrils curled along the main docking corridor, latching onto the steel frame as though feeding from it. "Dear God," Mia whispered. Connor leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "What the hell happened here?" No one answered. The shuttle docked with a metallic clang. The airlock hissed open, revealing the dim, flickering lights of the station's interior. A low hum vibrated beneath their feet, almost imperceptible but constant, like the resonance of some vast, sleeping creature. Elise tightened her grip on the rail as they stepped inside. The air was stale, laced with an acrid, organic smell. "Stick together," Connor ordered, raising his rifle. "No one wanders off." They passed through the main access corridor, their footsteps echoing against the metal floor. The walls were streaked with a dark, oily residue that seeped from cracks in the panels. Elise knelt down, touching a smear of it with her glove. It clung like sap, thick and warm. "Is this biological?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Elise nodded. "It's not just biological, it's spreading." They reached the central command hub, a wide room with a circular console in the middle. The station's emergency lights flashed overhead, bathing everything in a sickly red glow. Chairs lay overturned, data pads scattered across the floor. But no bodies. "Where is everyone?" Jian's voice was barely a whisper. Connor moved toward the console, scanning the emergency logs. "Final entry was 2 weeks ago," he muttered. "Crew reported neurological symptoms, headaches, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, and then nothing. No sign of evacuation." A chill ran down Elise's spine. They didn't leave. A sudden clang echoed down the corridor, followed by a wet, dragging sound. The team froze, instinctively forming a tight circle. "Movement," Connor growled, raising his weapon. Elise peered into the shadows. Something shifted at the edge of the corridor, slow and deliberate. Her heart pounded as the shape came into focus. A human figure staggered toward them. At first glance, it appeared to be a member of the station's crew, dressed in a tattered jumpsuit. But as it lurched closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The figure's skin was pale and translucent, stretched thin over a network of twitching tendrils. Its arms had elongated unnaturally, the bones reshaped into jagged filament-like appendages that twitched erratically. Its face was a ruin, mouth fused shut, eyes bulging and cloudy with fluid. Mia screamed, stumbling back. Connor didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot, the crack of the rifle shattering the silence. The creature's chest exploded in a spray of viscous black fluid, and it crumpled to the floor, twitching for a few agonizing seconds before going still. Gian let out a ragged breath, his face pale. That was human once. Elise knelt beside the corpse, fighting the bile rising in her throat. The tendrils writhed under the skin, still pulsing faintly even after death. "It wasn't just infected," she whispered. "It was remade." Connor reloaded his rifle, his face grim. "We need to get what we came for and get the hell out of here." The team moved deeper into the station, navigating the twisting corridors. The further they went, the more the station seemed consumed. Walls bulged with veiny growths, exhaling bursts of warm, damp air. Web-like membranes stretched across doorways, tearing wetly as they pushed through. In the medical bay, they found what remained of the crew, a tangled mass of bodies, fused together in a grotesque web of limbs and tissue. Their faces were frozen in expressions of agony, their eyes replaced by bioluminescent nodes that blinked faintly. Mia gagged, turning away. Yan sank to his knees, clutching his head. It wants us," he whimpered. "It's calling us, making us part of itself." Elise grabbed Jian's shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You're stronger than this. Fight it. Whatever this thing is, it can't have you." Jian's breathing slowed, but the haunted look in his eyes remained. Connor moved to a nearby console and accessed the research logs. A video feed blinked to life, displaying a frantic message from Dr. Leon Reed, the station's lead xenobiologist. "We thought it was a structure, a machine, but it's not. It's alive. It absorbs matter, reconfigures it, repurposes it. We tried to contain the growth, but it adapts. We can't stop it. It's in the air. It's inside us." The screen flickered, showing Dr. Reed coughing violently as tendrils pushed up through the skin of her throat. Her eyes bulged, and the video cut out. Connor stepped back, his face tight with rage. "We're leaving. Now." Elise hesitated, her mind racing. The megastructure wasn't just feeding, it was assimilating. If they didn't find a way to stop it, the infection would spread. But she nodded. Survival came first. They turned back toward the shuttle bay, but the corridor was different now. The growths pulsed more violently, closing in around them. The air grew thick and warm, making it harder to breathe. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through their bones. The walls began to pulse, and Elise felt something stir beneath her feet. "Run!" she shouted. The team sprinted toward the docking bay, their footsteps echoing against the wet, yielding floor. Tendrils erupted from the walls, snaking toward them like grasping fingers. Connor fired his rifle, tearing through the writhing mass, but the growths only thickened. Mia reached the airlock first, slamming the override button. The door hissed open. Elise shoved Jian inside, then turned to see Connor firing at a massive tendril that had wrapped around his leg. "Go!" he yelled. Elise grabbed his arm, pulling with all her strength. The tendril snapped, spraying black fluid, and Connor stumbled into the shuttle. The door sealed behind them. As the engines roared to life and the shuttle pulled away, Elise watched the station shrink in the distance. The megastructure loomed beyond it, silent and patient. Elise knew this was only the beginning. Whatever lived inside that thing, it wasn't finished with them yet. The shuttle's cabin was filled with the hum of life support systems, but to Elise, it was suffocatingly quiet. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken, something none of them dared to admit out loud. Jian sat in the corner, rocking slightly, eyes glassy as though staring into another dimension. His lips moved in silent recitation, though no sound came out. Connor sat opposite him, hand pressed against his wounded leg, blood soaking the makeshift bandage. Mia busied herself at the console, avoiding everyone's gaze. Elise knew that she was just trying to block out the memories. The bodies fused into the walls, the whispers crawling beneath her skin. The research station was now nothing but a speck in the viewport, but the megastructure still loomed, massive and oppressive. It drifted serenely above K2-18b, its spindly tendrils coiled like a predator waiting to strike. Elise clenched her jaw. They had barely survived the station. If they didn't figure out what this thing was and how to destroy it, none of them would make it home. The console beeped. Mia's head snapped up. Incoming transmission. Her fingers flew over the controls, trying to unscramble it. Static filled the room, followed by faint, crackling words. "Help! It's alive!" The voice was weak, distorted, but unmistakable. Elise's breath caught. "Torres," she whispered. Connor straightened. "She's dead," he said firmly. "We all saw her go down." But the voice crackled again, more insistent. "It's alive. It's not what you think. It's..." Elise leaned closer, heart pounding. "Torres, if that's you, where are you?" The transmission cut out, replaced by a low hum that vibrated through their bones. Jian let out a low moan, clutching his head. "It's not her," Jian whispered. His eyes rolled back as he shivered violently. "It's it. It's using her voice." Elise turned to Mia. "Track the signal. See where it's coming from." Mia's fingers danced over the console. After a few tense seconds, her face went pale. "It's coming from inside the megastructure." The shuttle was suddenly filled with the sound of Jian retching. He convulsed, collapsing to the floor as Elise and Connor rushed to his side. Thin white tendrils had erupted from the corners of his eyes, writhing like tiny worms. His mouth opened in a silent scream as his arms twisted unnaturally, the bones reshaping beneath his skin. Mia staggered back. "Oh my God! Hold him down!" Connor shouted, pinning Jean's flailing arms as Elise grabbed the medkit. But Jian was too far gone. His body buckled, and with a sickening crack, his ribs burst outward, splitting open like a grotesque flower. Filament-like structures bloomed from his chest cavity, pulsating with a faint, bioluminescent glow. Elise fell back, horrified. Jian's eyes met hers for a brief, agonizing moment, then dimmed as his body was overtaken by the growth. Within seconds, he was unrecognizable, a tangle of sinewy, twitching fibers. Connor slammed his fist against the console. "We have to destroy that thing. Now!" Elise fought to steady her breathing. Gian was gone, and the whispers. They had led him to this. "We need answers first," she said quietly, forcing herself to look at the mass that had once been her colleague. This is how it spreads. It rewrites the body, the crew on the station. They didn't die. They were repurposed. Mia's voice was shaking. It's evolving, adapting to everything we do. Connor grabbed his rifle. Answers won't matter if we're dead. Elise hesitated, but deep down she knew he was right. She moved to the console and brought up the external scanners. The megastructure's core was unmistakable, an enormous pulsating nucleus suspended at the center of the lattice work. "There," Elise said, pointing to the nucleus. "That's the heart. If we can destroy it." Mia frowned. "It's too massive for conventional weapons. We'd need a reactor overload." Connor nodded grimly. "We dock at the station's backup generator, rig it to blow, and take the whole thing out." Mia hesitated. "There's no way to remotely detonate something that size. Someone would have to stay behind." The room fell silent. Elise met Connor's gaze. She saw the same grim acceptance in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. None of them expected to survive this. Connor loaded a fresh magazine into his rifle. "Let's finish this." The shuttle docked with the megastructure's closest entry point, a twisted maw of bone-like struts and glowing membranes. As the airlock opened, a wave of hot, damp air rushed in, carrying that familiar, acrid stench of decay. They stepped into the structure, weapons raised. The walls pulsed faintly, like the chambers of a beating heart. Tendrils shifted above and below them, brushing against the metal floor like curious fingers. Mia scanned the layout. "Generators 2 levels down. We'll need to cut through this central node to get there." Connor took point, leading them through the labyrinthine passages. The deeper they went, the more the structure felt alive. Veins of bioluminescent fluid pulsed beneath their feet, lighting the path in a sickly green glow. They reached the core chamber, a vast, cathedral-like space where the nucleus hung suspended in a web of glowing filaments. It was massive, larger than any building Elise had ever seen. The surface writhed with branching tendrils that coiled and uncoiled like muscles flexing in slow motion. Elise stepped forward, staring at the nucleus. For a moment, she felt something stir in her mind, a whisper, low and inviting. "Come closer," it seemed to say. "Understand." She shook her head, forcing the voice away. "Set the charges." Connor and Mia moved quickly, placing the detonators along the main support beams. As they worked, Elise felt a shiver run down her spine. The filaments above them began to move, slowly at first, then faster. The entire chamber trembled. Connor cursed. "It knows!" The nucleus pulsed violently, sending out a shock wave that knocked them to the floor. Tendrils erupted from the walls, writhing toward them. "Move!" Connor yelled, firing into the mass. The bullets tore through the tendrils, but more kept coming. Mia activated the detonators. "Timer's set. We've got 5 minutes." Elise scrambled to her feet, pulling Mia toward the exit. Connor stayed behind, covering their retreat. The tendrils swarmed him, wrapping around his arms and legs. He screamed as they pierced his skin, but he kept firing. "Go!" he shouted. "Blow this thing to hell." Elise hesitated, but Mia pulled her forward. "We have to go." They sprinted back toward the shuttle as the walls collapsed around them. Elise stole one last glance back at Connor. His body was already disappearing beneath the mass of tendrils, but his eyes met hers one final time. There was no fear, only resolve. The shuttle door sealed behind them, and Elise launched the craft away from the structure. The reactor detonated seconds later. A blinding flash consumed the megastructure, and the shockwave rattled the shuttle as the explosion tore through the void. Elise slumped into her seat, watching as the lattice of bone and light unraveled, breaking apart into fragments that drifted into the darkness. But as the light faded, a final, faint whisper echoed in her mind. "This is not the end." Elise closed her eyes, letting the silence take her. The silence that followed the explosion was deafening. The shockwave had sent the shuttle spinning, alarms blaring, and Elise's vision blurred as she fought to regain control of the craft. The ship's stabilizers kicked in with a metallic groan, and the spinning slowed until the stars were steady once more. She gasped for breath, her heart pounding in her ears. Beside her, Mia clung to the console, her knuckles white. The cabin was filled with the acrid smell of burning circuits. "Status?" Elise rasped, her voice hoarse. Mia coughed, wiping blood from her nose. "Engines are fried, but we're stable. Life support is holding. Barely." Elise nodded, staring out the viewport. The megastructure was gone, a smoldering mass of debris, fragments of bone-like filaments drifting through space. The glow that had once pulsed within it was extinguished, replaced by a void darker than the surrounding night. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was too final. Connor was gone. The thought hit her with brutal clarity. She could still hear his last shout echoing in her mind, see his eyes locking with hers as the tendrils swallowed him whole. He had known he wouldn't make it out. He'd known, and still he'd stayed. Mia's voice was small, barely more than a whisper. "Do you think it's really over?" Elise didn't answer. She wanted to say yes, but there was a weight pressing down on her chest, an itch at the base of her skull that wouldn't go away. Something had changed. The whispers were gone, but in their absence was something worse, a waiting stillness as though the universe was holding its breath. Elise reached out to touch the console, but her hand shook. She clenched her fist, trying to stop the trembling. "Elise?" Mia's voice was sharper now, concerned. "Your arm." Elise looked down and felt her stomach lurch. A faint, branching pattern was spreading beneath her skin, thin, pale filaments spidering out from her wrist toward her elbow. She pulled up her sleeve in horror. It wasn't like Jiane's infection. There were no tendrils bursting from her flesh, but the veins beneath her skin shimmered faintly, as if something bioluminescent was coursing through her bloodstream. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no." Mia grabbed Elise's arm, panic flashing in her eyes. "It's not you. It can't be. We destroyed it." Elise yanked her arm away, stumbling back. She could feel it, pulsing faintly in her veins, a slow, alien heartbeat. She slammed her fist against the console, teeth gritted against the rising scream in her throat. "It's in me," Elise choked. I should have known. When it stopped whispering, it didn't die, it changed. Mia's eyes filled with tears. Then we'll cut it out. Like Torres did. We can stop it before it spreads. Elise shook her head. It's not like before. It's deeper, smarter. Mia's lip quivered. We'll find someone. There has to be someone who can... Elise cut her off, voice hardening. No one can fix this. You know that. She turned to the console and began tapping commands with practiced efficiency. Mia's expression twisted in realization. What are you doing? Elise's fingers moved faster, overriding the autopilot and setting coordinates. The planet's atmosphere. If I breach it, the gravitational pull will finish the job. No organism can survive re-entry. Not even this. Mia's breath hitched. No. She grabbed Elise's shoulder, spinning her around. You're not doing this. We'll figure something out. We always do. Elise's eyes softened, and she placed her hand over Mia's, squeezing it gently. We won't have time, Mia. You know I'm right. Tears streaked Mia's face as she shook her head. You're not going alone. Don't you dare. Elise forced a small, sad smile. Yes, I am. She stepped past Mia and opened the emergency shuttle hatch controls. A secondary pod, a two-person escape module, sat ready. You'll take this back to the observation station. They'll send help once they know what happened. Elise pressed the release button, and the pod hissed as it powered up. You'll survive. Connor would have wanted that. So do I. Mia grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. I won't leave you. Elise's voice cracked, but she held steady. You have to. The cabin trembled as the atmosphere of K2-18b began to pull them in. The window was awash with a dull red glow. Elise's time was running out. Mia's knees buckled and she sobbed openly. Please, Elise. Elise leaned forward, pressing her forehead against Mia's. You're stronger than you think, she whispered. I'm so damn proud of you. Before Mia could protest, Elise shoved her into the pod and slammed the hatch shut. Mia pounded on the glass, her cries muffled as the lock engaged. Elise activated the release, and the pod jettisoned away from the shuttle with a hiss of air, spinning toward the safety of space. Elise watched until the pod disappeared from sight, then turned back to the console. Her reflection stared back at her from the viewport, and she barely recognized herself. Her veins glowed faintly beneath her skin, the web-like pattern spreading toward her chest. The whispers were gone, but now she understood why. They didn't need to speak anymore. The megastructure had only been a fragment of something larger, a seed waiting to grow. Elise's hands trembled as she guided the shuttle into a sharp descent toward the exoplanet's surface. The craft began to shake violently, the hull glowing white-hot as it entered the thick atmosphere. Outside, K2-18b's clouds churned, a turbulent sea of crimson and violet gases. The air inside grew unbearably hot. The walls groaned as the heat intensified, and the cabin lights flickered. Elise closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting to Connor, Jane, Mia, the faces of everyone she had lost. Her final thought wasn't fear. It was hope. If she could stop it here, if she could burn it away before it spread further, maybe, just maybe, it would end with her. The hull began to crack, the shuttle tearing apart around her. A blinding light filled the cabin, and for a brief, perfect moment, everything was quiet. The rescue team found Mia's escape pod 3 weeks later, drifting near the outer rings of the K2-18 system. She was alive, though severely dehydrated and traumatized. She didn't speak for days. When she finally did, her first words were, "She saved us all." The official reports dismissed Elise Morgan's fate as an act of sacrifice, a lone scientist who gave her life to contain a biological anomaly. But Mia knew the truth. In her quietest moments, she still heard the echoes, the faint, rhythmic pulse of something vast and patient in the void. And deep down, she knew it wasn't truly over.